Amy Wax from Penn Law School, and
I'm Glenn Loury. I am at Brown University visiting at Columbia for the academic year.
right. And the purpose of this conversation is to discuss some of the ideas in my book, Race, Wrongs, and Remedies, and also just to have a dialogue about the state of Black America. So I just briefly, very briefly, because I have described my book in a previous blogging heads, my book,
Yes.
Race, Wrongs, and Remedies, is a book in which I try to use remedies law to refocus the conversation about race in America. The basic idea is that at this juncture in African American history, shall we say, in the United States, the main problems that are holding blacks back are really problems of behavior and not of overt racism, discrimination, really what society is doing to us, but the choices people are making. And I identify the main areas of difficulty as educational underachievement, high crime rates, and family breakdown. And my idea is that we really have to make a distinction between what forces contributed to those problems and how we're going to solve those problems. One of the main lessons of my book is that social programs, government services, the interventions so far have really had a minimal effect in bringing about equality, and they're destined to have that minimal effect. I just wanted to sort of emphasize that point because I've gotten a lot of comments about that. And my main theme here is not that we shouldn't help people or that we don't want to help people. We desperately do want to help people achieve equality. It's that size matters. So what do I mean by size matters? The magnitude, the size of the effect of any program that the government or intervention that society or the government has devised so far is minuscule compared to the size of the problem. The problems that blacks face even now, even though they've made progress, are really enormous compared to the effects of any of these interventions. So the comparison I would make is if you see a picture of the solar system, you'll see Jupiter. Jupiter is huge. That's the magnitude of the problems that remain. And then next to it is Pluto. Well, Pluto's not even a planet anymore, but that's what government programs and the interventions that we're all talking about can do. So we're really going to get a minimal effect, a minimal bang for our buck from those. There are two additional points. One is that, yes, we'd love to help the poor, we'd love to help blacks, and if we could find something that would bring about equality, we'd be more than willing to do it. I think people misunderstand conservatives when they think that they just, on moral grounds, don't want to help people who need help. That's just a complete fallacy. But there is scarcity. There are limitations to how many resources we have to throw at any given problem. And if we're not really making a dent, a significant dent, then we really have to ask ourselves, is it worth spending all that money on any given intervention, even though it makes everybody feel better that we're doing something? The second is, it's a distraction. And I talked about this with my blogging heads with Adam Serwer. I think there is just this tremendous impulse whenever we're talking about Black America to front and center start talking about discrimination, racism, the warped criminal justice system, how there's structural barriers, I mean, everything but what really is important, which is these terrible sort of cultural patterns that Black Americans have fallen into. Finally, I do want to sort of discuss something that I do talk about in my book, which is a parable to illustrate the point I'm making. This was the parable of the pedestrian, which was a centerpiece of my book. So what is the parable of the pedestrian? I think that the situation of Black America today is very much like a pedestrian who gets run over by a truck. It's the truck's fault. There's no question about that. He's sent to a rehab center, and the trucker pays for him to go. It's kind of a middling rehab center, no real bells and whistles, but it's good enough. And his therapist says, look, I know it's the trucker's fault, but without your massive, sustained, painful effort, you will never walk again. That is the only way. The trucker cannot do this for you. Only you can do it for yourself. So I think the lesson is there are some things that people can only do for themselves. And I think it's the things that people can only do for themselves that is going to make the difference to Black America now moving forward. That is the overwhelmingly most important project that remains. And I don't think that most people, at least not in academia or, the intelligentsia, and you're at Brown, so you're sort of ground zero for political correctness on this, I don't think they think about it that way.
Well, okay. Let me respond to you with a couple of questions, very fundamental conceptual issues in my mind as I listen to you. One of them is, why are we talking about Black America? What is, here we are in 2010. This is not 1963 anymore. What is Black America? I mean, this construction of a category and of a land. Now, there's a culture in Black America. You talk about a culture in Black America. I'm wondering how you've carved out, by racial designation, part of the poverty population that you see as a discrete entity about which we can then theorize, we can talk about behavior, we can talk about culture, and then we can also talk about agency. I mean, this is one of the things that I think needs to be explored here. You want, quote, Black America, close quote, to do something. And I'm just dubious about whether or not there is any such thing in 2010 as Black, quote unquote, Black America, whether or not it makes any sense social scientifically to talk about Black culture. I don't know where these boundaries are, and in particular, whether or not as a program of action, it makes any sense to talk about Black agency, about Black people doing anything, about collective action along racial lines. Mm-hmm. So can you clarify? Because,
sure.
If you really get down to cases and education is a problem, criminal offending and incarceration is a problem, family structure is a problem, I'm really quite unclear about how, quote unquote, Black people are supposed to, in some corporate way, quote unquote, solve those problems. Well, so that's one thing. I have other things too, but let's but
that's a good question. It's a perfectly legitimate question. I mean, the reason I'm talking about Black America is because other people are talking about Black America. I mean, Blacks are talking about Black America. So,
implicitly, I'm saying maybe we need to stop talking about Black America in 2010. That's implicit in my comment. But okay, other people are talking about it.
Let me explain. Just give me a chance here to explain. So, if you go to, if you teach courses on this, if you go to conferences on this, if you read articles on this, here's what you hear. You hear, why are Black Americans so other people are thinking along these lines. Why are Blacks lagging behind? Why are there these inequalities? Why are Blacks poorer? Why are Blacks, in worse schools, or why are they doing worse educationally? Why don't they own businesses? Why don't they have such low income? Why, there are all these questions being asked. Why do Blacks continue to be unequal? So someone is thinking about it in terms of Blacks as a group very much, and complaining that things are not going well for Blacks. We're generalizing. Obviously, every group is made up of individuals. So we're talking about average differences, lagging behind on average, and there's a lot of talk about that. The other thing is, our institutions, for better or worse, are conscious of racial identity. They're conscious of legacies of oppression and the need to compensate for them and make up for them. I mean, we have the whole affirmative action thing, which is real and it's out there and it's a social force. So people, are very conscious. Now, that doesn't mean that, the category of Blackness isn't muzzy on the margins. I mean, it is. We've got more and more interracial marriage and the like, and so that means that categories are softening, and I'm not denying that at the edges, but there still is a core
Yeah.
of Black America.
But
the
any
second
event-
point, if I may make one more point,
Well,
blacks, there's still a
before
lot
you
of
leave the first
social-
point, I understand that there is some sense in this group designation for reasons of our political convention and also for sociological reasons. But to link it up with dysfunction, to say black dysfunction, black criminality, black underperformance, is yet another move. And if you think about it in the context of other groups, there are other social groups in American society, and we do have restraint, I think, in how we formulate aggregate characterizations of those groups. We are worried about stereotyping, and we are worried about racism that may be implicit in some of those characterizations. So I'm just saying, okay, I'll stop because you wanted to go on. But my point is not to put my head in the sand and ignore the fact that racial designations are used. My point is to say there ought to be some boundaries or limits or cautions in the way in which we make racial imputations of, cultural, dysfunctional, and all the rest for, as I say, the obvious kind of reasons which, if we were to do comparisons with other group designations, they would come immediately, to mind.
Well, let me address that, but first I do want to make the second point I was making, which is when you say, well, Black Americans ought to take action and improve this or that.
Yeah.
The fact, there's just a social fact out there, which is that people tend to, associate with, socialize with, they tend to stick together. And I mean, blacks are especially relatively insular group. Now, part of that is because other people in the past have discriminated against them, so they tend to stick together. But, there's a lot of that going around. I mean, blacks do, as a fact, tend to stick together. There's a lot of intermarriage within the group. It's just a social fact that I am just going to put out on the table.
Can I ask you a question very quickly about that? I mean, do you think the low rates of intermarriage between blacks and whites is because blacks don't want to marry whites, or do you think it's because whites don't want to marry blacks?
Well, I think it's both. And don't want to marry, I think, is a little bit of a negative spin. I mean, the fact is, people...
Well, prefer not, I don't, whatever. Well, when left to their own devices, will choose otherwise.
I just don't know why it is. I think partly it's that there are different cultures operating. I mean, this is ironic because I have in the past week just run into a number of interracial couples. I don't know the answer to that, but I don't think it's all that relevant to the point that I'm about to make.
I do, actually.
About stereotyping. So
okay, I don't know the point you're about to make.
A little bit about stereotyping.
You go on.
See, I have a problem with the word stereotyping because I think, like blaming the victim, it's a conversation stopper, and it basically says, well, we're not allowed to talk about this. We're not allowed to talk about the fact, which is a social fact, right, that, I'll just give you an example. Blacks, commit crimes at 8 times the rate of whites. We're not allowed to do that because that's stereotyping. That's talking about groups. And, of course, when we talk about groups, we are not talking about every person in the group. That's a fundamental category mistake. It's one my students make all the time, and it drives me crazy. When we say blacks do X, we do not mean every single black does X. We don't mean that. We mean, on average, we have distributions, and those distributions don't overlap, right? So when we say the black family is disintegrating, do we mean that there are no married, conventional, traditional black families? Of course we don't mean that. We mean they're relatively much less common. They're rare among blacks relative to Asians. We're making group comparisons. Now, if you're saying, well, we shouldn't be making group comparisons, then I say, well, then let's all take our ball and bat and go home. I mean, why are we even talking about this? But then what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If we're not allowed to talk about group differences, then people should not be allowed to complain about group differences. I mean, if blacks are going to complain that they, on average, are lagging behind, then I think in dealing with that and responding to that, we get to talk about our theories of what's behind that. And in order to do that, we've got to quote-unquote stereotype, if by what you mean by stereotype is make generalizations. Now, I would like to say based in fact. I think there is a big difference between generalizations about group differences, distributions, averages based in fact versus unwarranted stereotypes, and those certainly exist.
Okay.
But I don't think we're talking about that right now.
Okay, so let me respond. So I'll go with a metaphor of my own. Okay, so now family structure. I want to make a point about the mistaken imputations of causality that attend careless, willful stereotyping. Okay, you've said stereotyping is a conversation stopper. I don't want to stop the conversation, but I do want to discipline the conversation, and I want to make the conversation rigorous. So I want to give an example to illustrate the point I'm making. I'm saying stereotyping is dangerous because it can be an indication of lazy thinking, and it can lead to categorizations and conclusions about causality and ultimately about responsibility, which are simply erroneous. Okay, and so that's my broad point, and I want to try to illustrate it with an example. Intermarriage. Okay, so there's a low rate of intermarriage between blacks and whites in the United States. It has risen in the last generation, but it's still relatively low, especially as you compare to other non-European population groups in the United States, Latinos or Asians who intermarry with Anglo-Caucasians in U.S. society at a much higher rate than do blacks. Okay. Now, and the related is the problem of the structure of the African American family, the out-of-wedlock birth rates, the low marriage rates, the relatively high separation rates, the rates of multiple partnership, and so on, which we may take to be evidence of a degradation or dissolution or something like that of norms of behavior having to do with family formation that have consequences for children that impede the progress of the community and so forth. Okay. Now, the observation that I want to make is the following. In the world in which black men and black women interact with each other, to the extent that African American women have a live outside option of possibly coupling up with non-black men, to that extent, the bargaining dynamic between black men and black women looks very different. If black women have many options, black men behave more responsibly because they have more competition for the attentions and services, if you'll let me speak in that way, of black women, which would lead to a very different dynamic of intra-black gender relations to the extent that interracial gender relations were different. So now I come along and I observe a situation in which there's a low marriage rate, high out-of-wedlock birth rate, and in general fraught gender relations amongst black men and women. And I ascribe it to black culture because I, following your example, would say, well, look, I'm just looking at the behavior. If you just look at the averages, if you just look at the statistics, here's what I see. I see a high divorce rate. I see a high out-of-wedlock birth rate, and so on. This is what black people are doing. This is how they are. But on the argument that I've just been making, I think a person would be wiser to observe, well, this group that I'm seeing, these blacks, are embedded within a society in which there are other people whose behaviors are also a part of the larger system of social interaction that I'm engaged in, that I'm observing here. And to impute to this group, about whom it's true, the averages are what one is saying they are. They really are discernibly distinct on the average between the racial groups. But those differences in averages would mask, unless we were to look deeper, a causal system in which the behavior of everybody, including people who were out-group members, was partly implicated in the dynamic. Okay? So that's why I'm saying a mistake would be made if we were to simply leave it at, here's the way that black people are, it's a matter of black culture, and just like that. And there are other examples I could give along the same lines, but I don't want to filibuster. I just want you to respond to this point. Okay. That's stereotyping. It's not political correctness. It's social analytic correctness that I'm concerned about. It's not that I want to stop the conversation. I want to discipline the conversation, that it be rigorous, and that it not too quickly fly off to to some conclusions, some categorical imputations. Black people are like this, which would really be a kind of first level social analysis and not a deeper and more complete analysis of the problem.
Well, if your point is that the reason that, there's so much weakness in the black family and that men don't behave perhaps on average as well as they should, and, the relationships break up, or they play the field, or they maybe are not as loyal or faithful as they should be, and all of that stuff, it's because black women don't have outside options. We're going to have to agree to disagree on that. I just think that's make weight. And it doesn't make any sense to me at all. You're basically having a very small tail wagging a very large dog here. I mean, there are other groups historically that have been tremendously insular in their marriage patterns. And, effectively, they don't outmarry, and no one will outmarry with them or at very low levels, and they have not behaved that way at all. I mean, Asians.
No.
Recently, Jews, all right? Jews, people would not marry them. They would not marry others. They were solely marrying within their group, and yet they're the most uxorious people on earth. I mean, their men are the most uxorious men on earth. They don't behave the way blacks behave. These are vast cultural patterns that I don't think can be attributed to the fact that white men are less reluctant to marry black women. If black men and women, wait one second, if black men and women would marry each other at high rates, that problem would be solved. There'd be a partner for everyone. So, to assign causation.
I just want to make this one, no, my point is not that, quote, pathology, such as it is in the gender relations amongst African Americans, is due to the, low number of white potential suitors of black women, although that hypothetical that I posed did suppose that it were higher and said that the outcome would be different. No. My point is that...
Well, I thought you were kind of making a point like that.
Yeah, no.
That this was
but as you go to other groups, you say Asians, and of course Asians is some, polyglot category of many different peoples, of many different cultures and backgrounds. No, my point was that there's a particular history of African American gender relations that is partly intertwined with the history of interracial gender relations, and I would point to the mulatto population, the population of mixed race, or ultimately mixed race persons who constitute the bulk of African Americans today, who are descended from the progeny of relationships between white men and black women that took place both under slavery and in the decades after the end of slavery, under conditions that we could go into, but were not particularly positive for African Americans. And this whole argument.
We're talking about the past. So here's my question: how do we go forward? I mean, I do think these conversations do tend to be about the past. I want to know what's the solution. Right?
Okay, you want to know the solution, but I want to first deal with the point at hand. Okay, we can go on to the solution.
I don't think the past is informing the solution. I mean, how does it guide us to how do we get out of this rut?
Fine, let's talk about that, but let's talk about one thing at a time. I'm talking about stereotyping right now, and I'm talking about the point that it's not political correctness, it's social analytic correctness that's at issue. And I'm saying that if you say black culture is like this, in the case of family relations, they don't marry, they don't take care of their kids, and so forth and so on, okay? And you make that as a characterization of black culture, what I want to say is, embed the 30 million African Americans and 300 million Americans, understand the dynamic of social relationships between these people as the consequence of a complex and unfolding centuries-long dynamic in which miscegenation and so forth were elemental aspects, and see that we're seeing American culture, and in particular white American and Southern white American culture, reflected to some degree in the aggregate statistics about black family structure that you would point to. So we can talk about how to go forward, but I'm just saying, before I accept the problems of black America are behavioral. They manifest themselves primarily in three different areas: education, family structure, and criminal behavior. And unless black people behave differently, unless their culture is somehow or another transformed, we're not going to be able to solve this problem, because after all, it's the tail wagging the dog if the government tries to solve it. Before I go down that road with you, I want to at least explore this notion of, well, I'm not looking at black culture. simply when I see these behavior patterns and these average statistics. I'm looking at American culture, which has a racial inflection in it that has a very concrete historical dynamic, and that was not at all favorable to black people. So we can talk about the future, but of course, presumably, we were going to do that constructively. We'd have to engage with and properly understand the past.
Well, there's very little you're saying that I disagree with. I mean,
Good.
One minor point I would make, and I agree that it's not like these patterns are confined to blacks, of course, because we have a class gradient in this country, too.
Yep.
On things like criminality and educational failure and all that. We've got all that going on as well. But, of course, it's a matter of degree. I'll come back. Size matters. So, yes, we're alarmingly inching up to a 30% or 35% out of wedlock birth rate for white America. Very alarmingly, I think. But that's very different from a 73%. So it's a matter of degree. And if you're talking about the well-being of a group, and people do talk a lot about the well-being of blacks as a group, for better or worse, this is a big topic of conversation, then you have to acknowledge that, I've just lost my picture here, you have to acknowledge that, these patterns are not confined to blacks, but they are just much more dramatic and dominant. There's another thing going on, which is sort of a tipping point phenomenon, which is what is the norm? If you've got a group in which 25 or 30% are born out of wedlock, that's not the norm. That's, the exception. But if you have a group where it's 73%, now you've got the norm. So that's a very different phenomenon. So that's the only thing I'd say there. Okay.
What's the out-of-wedlock birth rate?
Else you're saying?
What's the premarital birth rate in Sweden? Do you know?
Okay. Let me talk about
it's quite high. I mean,
Wait one second. Sweden, and I know a lot about Sweden, has virtual marriage. Now, what do I mean by virtual marriage? Everything but the paper. The father, the mother, they live together in this high bourgeois family. They live together as if married.
Okay.
They act as if married. They stick by their kids. It's a completely different cultural phenomenon, and they are drawing down their strong bourgeois cultural capital to keep it together. We have a very different pattern here in this country. All right, we have a sort of a kind of round robin of men coming in and out of women's lives, in and out of children's lives. It's radically different. If we had Sweden, we'd be okay, but we don't. I think the comparison is just doesn't go through at all.
Let me drop it and move on then, because I don't want to argue about Sweden. I want to raise another question. Okay, so question number one had to do with stereotypes. You and I maybe disagree to some extent because you don't want a political correct evocation to shut a conversation down, and I don't want a social analytically incorrect set of surmises or superficial conclusions to lead to the negative categorization of a group of people. So that's that. But now I want to talk about, you say size matters and the government can only do so much. Now,
can I just say, you don't want you don't want generalizations for a negative categorization of people, but
by their race, yes, right. I don't think blackness has anything to do with it. We're not going to be able
to talk about the problems if we don't do that.
We can talk about the problems in other terms. The question here is not whether we talk about problems. The question is how we label them and how we think about them, okay? So these are problems of American society. This is my general attitude here would be, I want to separate a black conversation for black people to have and an American conversation for Americans to have. The black conversation in a church basement somewhere, to the extent that it takes place, will draw on communal resources to exhort people about what we as black Americans could do. The same way that, Catholics might do something, or Jews might do something, or Armenians might do something, whatever it might be. Black Americans, to the extent that there's some kind of coherent communal structures ongoing, could have an internal deliberation about what black people should do. But poverty, failed schools, crime, jails overflowing, kids not taken care of, these are American problems in American cities, populated by people who are under the complex set of forces that are characteristic of American society. So when we segregate off this bottom layer of this hierarchical structure in American society, which for historical reasons that we have to some degree gone into, has a racial coloration, and we impute to the causes of that circumstance to culture, and I put the word in quotes, characteristics said to be indigenous to these racially defined people, we're making a move, and that's the move that I'm questioning. It's not a statement of not wanting to talk about a problem. It's a statement of the terms that I want to frame the problem in. I'll give you a chance to respond to that because I want to move on to something else.
Well, I don't know how much more I'm going to say about it, because I think the word indigenous is a dangerous word, because no one I'm not being essentialist about this. I'm not saying,
no?
Blacks are essentially this or
I got the
essentially
wrong
that.
impression, because it really does sound as essentialist.
Okay, well,
I mean, black culture is
that.
Well, okay.
I'm not doing that. I'm very empirically driven here. I'm very driven by the data. And I know that blacks are a fairly cohesive group. I know that whatever problems there are out there, and these are in some respect American problems, they are often driven by blacks. I think the crime problem in this country, I'm sorry, it is true, is overwhelmingly, certainly within cities, it is a black problem. It is a minority problem, okay? Overwhelmingly. I mean, your chance of being, victim of gun violence by a white person in New York City is essentially non-existent. And that's a fact. It's blacks and Hispanics are responsible for 97% of the gun violence in New York City. Now,
the chance of being victimized by a college graduate gun violence is essentially zero. The chance of being victimized by somebody whose income is more than $35,000 a year and who worked 2,000 hours last year is also essentially zero. Okay?
Well, no, it's not essentially zero, actually.
Well, whatever. I mean, you understand what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the black designation is hardly an accurate social analytic characterization of the threat of gun violence. It hasn't got anything to do with race. Amy, I don't believe that you think it does.
No, it does. I disagree. I'm going to have to say something about that. I mean, just take poor whites, or whites who are just high school graduates or even high school dropouts. I mean, you compare whites and blacks have a much, much higher rate. So you can do the socioeconomic controls, and we're seeing different behavior. Take educational underachievement. The gap between whites and blacks in test scores is the greatest at the top for people making more than $70,000 a year. That's where it's biggest, right? So control for income, you still have enormous differences in educational achievement between blacks and whites. So, no, I'm going to disagree.
Okay, so we have
factoring out class is not going to erase the differences.
But we have these empirical regularities, which you, on the one hand, want to say, you don't adopt an essentialist view, and so you don't think race per se determines these things. But on the other hand,
race per se.
But on the other hand, you want to insist that if we're going to go forward and do something about this, we have to acknowledge these racial disparities in racial terms. And I'm just befuddled by that, because unless there's a racial cause, if I don't believe that there's a racial cause, then the empirical regularities, racial as they may be, ought to point me toward other things correlated with race, which are the actual causes involved. Okay.
Okay. Well, so when you use the term racial cause, that can mean a lot of different things, right? I'm not saying that there's something about having black skin or being black that's doing it. I'm saying
then what?
There are cultural threads in the black community that are self-perpetuating. There are sort of cultural understandings, yes, within a group that have nothing to do with like your genes or DNA or anything. It's just a set of expectations and norms and understandings that get reinforced. I mean, I'm Jewish. There are cultural understandings within the Jewish community, patterns, behaviors, norms, customs.
And would that account for the overrepresentation of Jews amongst people who are arrested for insider trading, let's say?
Well, yeah. I mean, I actually think that
we think there's a Jewish. I'm sorry. Do you think that in terms of talking about white-collar crime on Wall Street, embezzlement, insider trading, Ponzi schemes, and so forth, it would be useful to construct those problems in terms of Jewish and non-Jewish categorizations, and that we would be putting our heads in the sand or not willing to deal with the reality if we weren't prepared to acknowledge the overrepresentation of Jews amongst bad actors in that arena? I mean, wouldn't such a conversation border on anti-Semitism? Wouldn't a person be rightfully questioned as to why do they dwell on the Jewishness of the people who are being apprehended for financial crimes? I mean, wouldn't that be the right way to respond to a person who kept telling me about all the Jewish names on the list of the malefactors that have been arrested, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, first of all, I don't sort of sit here, ready, willing, and able to accuse people of anti-Semitism because they're pointing that out, right? First of all, empirically, is it really true? That's the first question. Secondly, look, there are a ton of Jews on Wall Street. I mean, Wall Street is very dominated by Jews. Jews go into finance. That's a big area for them. So it's not surprising that, of the people who are, and relatively, I think Jews have a very low rate of criminality overall. But when they do commit crimes, they're white-collar crimes. Those are the sorts of crimes they tend to be involved in. We can talk about why that is and whether it, what it means about Jewish culture and whether Jewish culture is criminogenic as opposed to not criminogenic.
Or money grubbing, or all of these other kinds of stereotypes that I don't think would be particularly welcome in a decent public discussion about public affairs in the United States.
I'm discussing it, but size matters.
Okay.
So
let's go on to.
If I can make the point, so I would ask, well, what percentage of Jews are involved in crime? Does that really mean that the Jewish culture is criminogenic, or are we just talking about some real bad apple outliers? And now we can get into some comparisons where we say, well, gee, 2% of Jewish men are involved in crime. 30% of black men have been involved with the criminal justice system. Now we're seeing a contrast.
Which says a lot more about the criminal justice system than it says about black men.
I don't agree with that, but we could,
Let me go on to my other point.
That's unreal, that's not true. Black men are disproportionately involved in crime. I don't agree with that.
Forgive me, but I'd like to go on to a separate point. And that has to do with size matters and what the government can do. So now let's just go back 80, 100 years. Let's look at American society, American urban society, industrial society, on the eastern seaboard in the Midwest, big cities, large immigrant populations coming in. Lots of poor people from Slavic, Eastern European, Southern European, Irish, and so forth. Settlement house movement, tenements, slums, a lot of crime, a lot of social pathology. Were those facts about the history of inequality and social dysfunction in American society reflective of the problematic cultures of these immigrant populations? Was there something wrong with the Italians, with the Jews, with the Irish, with the Slavs who were moving into these cities in the United States in the 1890s, 1900, 1910? And were doing all the things that they were doing with the alcohol, with the et cetera. I mean, we all know about this history. Was there? So, I mean, there's a kind of two-part question here. Does that too, that part of American history, reflect basically, and it should be understood in cultural terms, that there was something problematic about these cultures? And if so, how could we account for the dramatic changes that occurred in the ensuing decades with respect to these populations? And then the second question is, did what the federal government had to do in the 1930s and the 1940s and 50s, I'm talking about reaction to the Depression, the mobilization for the Second World War, the GI Bill and all of that, have anything at all to do with the movement of these populations out of their relatively marginal social condition into the mainstream of American life? Did the creation of the American middle class in the years from 1940 to 1960, which helped to mobilize these marginal ethnic populations, have anything to do with with government activity? So obviously I think it did. I think it had a lot to do with government activity. And I also think that Italian culture, Irish culture, Jewish immigrant culture as an explanation for the bad behavior of some of those people would be, wouldn't be a particularly enlightened or helpful way of trying to understand that history. And I would have to say the same thing about blacks today.
Okay, well, let me just make a few points. There's a lot there. You've put a lot on the table here, okay? Number one, I actually recently read a couple articles about this, of historical crime rates and differential crime rates among groups and immigrants. There are a couple of new papers in demography about this. Number one, let's just get this straight, okay? The absolute crime rates in this country until in the 1960s were much, much lower than they are today as an absolute matter. So, you know, it's like we were born yesterday in the 1960s. You know, Charles Blow in the New York Times says murder rates are at a historic low today. Well, you know, only if you were born in the 60s are they. You go back to the 50s, 40s, 30s, crime rates in every category were a mere fraction of what they are today. So as a general matter, we were a much more law-abiding society, than we are today. And it's in the 60s that crime went off the charts. Now, it's come back down a little bit, but it's still higher historically than it was before that. So that's
But you don't deny that the crime problem, such as it was in the 1920s or 10s or 30s, was in the big cities primarily concentrated in the ethnic lower working class.
But I think it's very important that the absolute crime rates were much lower. So even among all these groups, they were much more law-abiding, right, as a general matter, than we are today, and then, I'm sorry to have to say it, than minorities are today.
Yeah, but American society is different. No, I'm not disputing the fact. I'm saying I'm saying what can we learn from that fact about ethnic specific.
I'm going to address ethnic differences. There were ethnic differences.
Exactly.
Right? So, for example, in the paper I read showed this. Swedes and Germans had much lower rates of crime than, let's say, Irish and Italians or Mexicans more recently, and the authors of the paper weren't very happy about this. They were trying to, you know, come up with reasons why that should be so. But it is true, right? So there were these differences, and you could say that Irish culture or Italian culture was relatively more criminogenic for whatever reason than Teutonic and Nordic cultures, and of course that persists today, right? Now
you could say that. I would never say something.
I'm saying it.
Yeah.
Right? I'm suggesting it. Now, what happened?
Criminogenic.
That's right.
Cultures are criminogenic.
Criminogenic. There are elements of some cultures that are more forgiving or conducive to breaking the law than other cultures. And let's talk about Jews. I mean, Jews historically have the lowest crime rate in the United States practically, and that is a fact, right? So, and Holocaust survivors, essentially zero crime. So you could say, well, these people have been oppressed, they've been persecuted. If they were high crime people, we'd say, of course they're high crime people. What do you expect? They've been treated so badly. In fact, they're the lowest crime people imaginable. So there are differences in the way people behave. There's no doubt about it, right? Now, what happened?
The question, though, Amy, is whether or not those differences have anything to do with the ethnic cultures that you're imputing to these people. That's the question.
They could. I mean, why? You're ruling that out ahead of time. You're telling me that's a thought we can't have. Don't go there.
No, I'm saying I'm extremely dubious about it, and I'm demanding a rigorous demonstration of the claim. That's all, because I'm saying the claim has political consequences, and we ought to be reticent to make it unless we know it's true. That's what I'm saying.
Well, it's the kind of claim that's very, very hard to hard and fast verify. Okay.
Exactly.
But you know, people have talked about it. I mean, Edward Banfield has talked about why, for example, southern Italy
yes.
Is a hotbed of crime compared to northern Italy.
Yes.
What are the cultural differences? And he's actually tried to identify some of those cultural differences. Southern Italy is much more tribal. It's much more insular, right? There's less of a sort of civic culture of general standards that this, now my eyeball's going up and down here, so I'm sorry, you're getting dizzy. I mean, we can talk about these things. You're basically saying we can't talk about these things, but it is a matter of speculation because the science of culture is an imperfect science. I mean, it's not science. It's sociology, and that's tough to make rigorous. All right, so this eyeball is confused because I'm waving my hands.
Okay,
yeah. But can I just talk about then the 50s and the 40s and 30s, 40s, 50s? And I did a little of this with Adam Serwer. I simply reject the proposition that the reason that these groups progressed, became more affluent, became more mainstream and maybe more well-behaved was because of government programs. I mean, I just reject that proposition. The GI Bill was a lovely thing, and it was wonderful, and a lot of people went to college. But the fact is that the vast majority of people in this country, until very recently, never went to college. That wasn't on the radar screen. That wasn't part of it. They made their way in the economy and in society without a college degree. And they did it by simple rules, simple precepts, right? Work hard, obey the law, stick by your family, simple rules for simple people. We don't need social scientists to tell us what the formula is for getting ahead, because we know that formula.
Well,
I
Amy,
mean, it's obvious in an opportunity society.
Come on, this is
The
with due respect. With due respect, I think this is a very simplistic story that you're telling. You know, when the unemployment rate is 25%, you can stick by your family and keep your nose clean all you want. You still don't have a job.
We have a recession right now.
No. I'm saying there was a Great Depression. Okay.
Oh, okay.
I'm saying that the mobilization that leads up to the Second World War and jerks the unemployment rate up very high and really brings the economy back online had a lot to do with the success of the people who were struggling in those years. And I'm saying that. Well, I'm not really saying this is Ira Katznelson's argument, the political scientist at Columbia, whose book When Affirmative Action Was White tells the story of the GI Bill, the liberalization of labor laws that allowed for workers to organize more effectively, and other activities promoting home ownership and extending credit to people and so forth. That he argues had a great deal to do, he says, when affirmative action was white. He's basically saying the beneficiaries of government activity between 1930 and 1960 that helped to create the American middle class were vastly disproportionately white working class people because those programs were racially biased. Now, I don't want to dwell on the racial bias point. I want to dwell on the efficacy of government programs to help to create a middle class. I don't think there would have been bedroom suburbs to which aspiring people could have moved without the investments in systems of transportation and other subsidies to home ownership that the government put into place, and so on. And you say not everyone gets a college education. That's true, but the social mobility of these relatively marginal ethnic groups, I think, was the historians I do believe can demonstrate was materially abetted by the public investments that were ongoing. I'm simply trying to make the point that government activity, okay, a point with which you have already said you disagree, that government activity contributed materially to the creation of the American middle class.
Well, I don't disagree with that. I think good governance and, good basic policies, especially to keep the economy humming, are important. I never would disagree with that at all. I think the government does have a role to play in clearing the channels of opportunity and giving people the chance to see the fruits of their efforts. And
but then why do you say that
the
government can do nothing about black marginality?
We have, I think, a little bit of a disagreement about the relative magnitude of these different components. We have a little disagreement. I think that, look to Europe, but they didn't have the same policy of home ownership or the like, or suburbanization there, and yet their populations, they became wealthier, their economies grew. There are different ways for these things to happen when you've got the basic human capital of the people, right? You've got strong families, strong norms, people who are determined by dint of their own efforts and discipline to get ahead. There are a lot of different ways to skin that cat. And no, I'm not saying that the government policies have nothing to do with it. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that without that human capital, without the proper values, it ain't going to happen. All right? So it's a combination of both. And I'm also not saying that blacks weren't discriminated against back then, because they certainly were. No one can deny that.
But you are saying that blacks don't have the values or the human capital that would allow them to benefit from government activity today?
Not as much as they need. Obviously, many blacks do, and they have, and they've gotten ahead. But once again, we're back to groups.
Yeah. So let's make this concrete, and I know we're kind of getting on in time here. At least my time is limited. Mm-hmm. Yours is probably too. We can always continue the conversation on another occasion.
Okay.
I want to talk about education. So you have these three things: family, crime, and education, which you say are areas in which the behavior of at least the lower class element of the black population in the United States is the main impediment to their being able to do better, and there's not much the government can do about that. Well, gee, when I look at education, I think, true, what happens at the home is really important. True, the behavior of students is absolutely fundamental. No matter what you do at the school, if the students are putting in the effort, if the parents aren't abetting the school's activity by supporting what needs to be done, it's not going to work. But I do think that the fundamental problem with urban education is its political economic organization. It's the unions. It's the work rules. It's the efficacy of teachers in the classroom, and so on. It may also, to some degree, be the resources. And that's something that government, with great difficulty and amidst much consternation, but nevertheless, that's something that government can change. In fact, that's something that only government could change, either by making resources available to parents so that they could have outside options and not be reliant on a school system that's failing, and or by reorganizing the functioning of those systems that are failing so that the kind of things that the reformers want to do that are known to work are permitted to be put into place. But in either case, those are political, public, large government undertakings that would need to be done. And to blame the failure of urban education on the culture of African Americans is, well, Amy, it's maybe just a little offensive. It's like, I don't know, man. I mean, why wouldn't we want to think about that as a public problem and frame it in public terms rather than impute it to the deficiencies of the cultures of the people who are really victims, in this case, literally, of failed public policy?
Okay. Well, let me first get something on the table here.
Yeah.
Right? I would never take the position that education can't be improved. I think there are a lot of problems with education in this country. If I were education czar, I'd make a lot of changes, and I think things would get better. So, I'm not going to defend the education system as the best we can have.
Noted.
Forget that. The second thing I want to say is you said the failure of urban education. What about the failure of suburban education, Glenn? My children go to a large public suburban high school outside Philadelphia, and I've tried desperately to move them to private school, and they won't go. They love their high school. It's about 25% black, 25% Asian, the rest, this, that, and the other. It is a true melting pot. It's not the best public high school in suburban Philadelphia, but it's far from the worst. It's pretty good, right? And I live in a pretty wealthy neighborhood. My kids come home and they ask me, what is going on? Why are the black kids never in the honors classes? Why are they never in the AP classes? Why do they do so badly? Why don't they ever, make the honor society? Why is it whenever there's a fight, it's the black kids who are getting involved in it? What is with the black kids? And I have to listen to this. All right, I have to field these questions. The first thing I say to them is, don't ever say that in school. I'm just terrified that they're going to say something that's going to get them into trouble. So that's the main problem is political correctness. I just spend most of my time warning them. But beyond that, those are good questions.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a perfectly good school. I wouldn't send my kids to this school if it weren't decent, right? It's not the best, and it's far from the worst, and yet the same pecking order is there.
Yep.
The white kid, the Jewish kids and the Asian kids are on the top. The black kids are at the bottom. They're talking back to the teachers. They're getting into fights. They're getting suspended. Every one of them? No, not every one of them. So I think to say, well, this is the failure of urban schools, the problem is much bigger than that, Glenn. It's just much bigger than that.
We should, deserves more discussion than we have time to give it. I agree with you that there are some big issues about why middle class blacks who have not delivered in terms of performance in the upper ranks of American society to the extent that one might have forecast based on purely on their economic circumstances. I mean, the suburbs of Washington, D.C., the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, the suburbs of Chicago, and I suppose we could point to other places, are full of six-figure income African-American families. And yet,
Glenn, it's not the schools.
And yet, when you look for and the schools are okay. I mean, they may have their problems, but they're nothing like the failed schools of inner city District of Columbia or Philadelphia or whatever. But when you look to see who's going to Caltech or MIT, or who's getting high percentiles on the SATs or whatever, blacks are underrepresented. And when you look in the very selective venues of high performance in the academy and the graduate schools, the law schools, and the medical schools, again, you see underrepresentation of African Americans relative to other groups, some of those other groups are not particularly socially advantaged. I'm talking about Asian immigrants, not all of whom are coming here with pockets full of money. There is an issue. I want to concede that. On the other hand, I still want to say that when I look at the bulk of the low-income black population dependent upon the public schools of Philadelphia, Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, the District of Columbia, and so forth and so on, I would not conclude that the terrible education. I mean, these kids are not learning how to read, as you know. They're not learning how to count. They're coming out of these schools unable to function in the contemporary, highly competitive, globalized world. And I would not identify those two problems, the one problem being underperformance of the African-American middle class in good suburban school systems, which is a real thing, with the absolute wasteland in terms of the cognitive development of the students who are would have no alternative but to attend the failed inner-city public school systems. Okay. Both are problems, but the latter is just a huge, huge problem, and I say it's mainly a problem of failed institutions, not of inadequate culture. So.
Okay. I think there's a lot more to say about this. I actually see them on a continuum, okay, because I truly do question whether even in these so-called terrible schools and, where the unions are, have them in their grip and the teachers are not doing anything, et cetera, I really would question whether are the teachers really not trying to teach them basic stuff, or is it that the students, for whatever reason, are just so ill-equipped when they come in, so indifferent, and we know from Roland Fryer and from other social scientists that these black students are coming into school significantly behind their counterparts, so they're already behind the 8 ball. And then to turn around and say, well, it's the school's fault that they can't learn arithmetic or they can't learn to read, or, I really question that. I just am not sure that is the locus of the problem or even the main problem. But I personally think it's the abject failure of the family, just collapse.
Now,
that would be the word.
You cite Fryer, and I think I know what you're referring to in terms of the entry-level differences in cognitive ability of black and white students when they're coming into the early grades. Right. But Fryer has also demonstrated in his evaluation of the Harlem Children's Zone's charter schools in New York City that here are a set of schools that are drawing on the same population around in Harlem that would attend New York City public schools, and yet he's shown that the charter schools are doing much better with those kids in terms of teaching them to read and to be able to do arithmetic by the 3rd grade. They are significantly overperforming kids who are at parallel schools in the public system in New York City.
Okay, and I'm not denying there's not room for improvement. I'm not denying that. But even this goes back to size. Even when you see those improvements, and we have to see if they can be sustained, right, you're still got a huge group gap, right? You're going from, the vast majority, even not even basic, to, let's say, 50% at grade level or 60% at grade level. In other words, we're still seeing group gaps, and the question is, what is going to close them? Right. Now, we're now like over an hour plus on this conversation.
Okay, why don't we call it
think about continuing another time.
Why don't
All right?
we? Yeah. why don't
Okay,
we?
so thank you very much.
All right, Amy. You take good care.
Bye.
We'll talk again. Bye.
Bye.